Good evening. I am also a Philadelphian, and so it's hard for me to hear Skip cheering for the Celtics. I grew up and the Celtics were not the team to cheer for in Philadelphia. I had the pleasure of editing the Ann Petry Library of America volume, and I jumped at the opportunity to do so because I am a Petry evangelist. She remains one of my favorite authors, and she is an author I believe is one of the best writers our nation has produced, and yet one who remains little known. She's constantly discovered and rediscovered. So the opportunity to introduce her to a broader readership and to secure her place and stature in our literary history continues to be of utmost importance to me. The publication of her first novel, The Street, in 1946 brought critical acclaim and a degree of literary celebrity. It's set in wartime Harlem. It's her most famous novel, the most famous novel of an unfamous writer. It's the story of Ludi Johnson, a beautiful single mother who strives to leave domestic service for more lucrative employment. Her idea of success is inspired by Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, by an Italian immigrant shopkeeper, and her wealthy white employers, all of whom encourage her to work hard, save money, and create a better life for herself in the quote-unquote best country in the world. But each of these mentors, unfortunately, fails to warn her of the pitfalls and the obstacles that await her as a working-class Black woman in a pre-Brown versus Board of Education America, in a Jim Crow America. She is under surveillance constantly by a predatory neighbor. She is stalked by her building superintendent. She is watched, cultivated, and trapped like prey by the owner of her apartment building, who also owns the club where she hopes to work. She has nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Street became the first novel by a Black woman to sell more than 1 million copies. It was always in print. It never went out of print. It was published in several paperback editions, translated into French, Spanish, Portuguese, German. Its author appeared on magazine covers and glossy feature articles in magazines. But around the time, just as her literary celebrity grew, it was the same time as the specter of the second Red Scare began to rise, and Petry and her husband returned to Old Saybrook, Connecticut, in 1947, which is where she's from. She's a native New Englander. She grew up in Old Saybrook. They purchased a home, and she avoided celebrity, avoided publicity, except as it directly related to her writing. Some of this insistence on her privacy, I think, came from a desire to protect herself, but also, I think, because her New York years had been filled with leftist friends and colleagues, and she despised the kind of anti-communist fervor that swept the nation in the 1950s. Although she had never been a member of the Communist Party, she actually was a member of the Republican Party, as were many African Americans prior to Roosevelt, because it was the party of Lincoln. But she despised the anti-communist fervor that swept the nation. She was openly supportive of Paul Robeson. And her third novel, which I think is her most ambitious novel and is collected in the Library of America volume, The Narrows, which was published in 1953, is set in a small Connecticut city, articulates her disdain for McCarthyism. I think it's very courageous that it articulates her disdain for McCarthyism, which she says hunts, in the protagonist says, hunts both communists and Negroes. The Narrows is ostensibly the story of a tragic love affair between the married Camilla Sheffield, who is a white socialite and heiress, daughter of the town's wealthiest family and heir to the Treadway munitions fortune, and Link Williams, who is a kind of Robeson-esque figure, a scholar athlete who is a graduate of Dartmouth's and a son of the town's Black community. He's, beloved by the town's Black community, which is known as the Narrows. That's the name of the community. His name is Link Williams. When Link tries to end their relationship, Camillo falsely accuses him of rape. He is arrested, released on bail, but eventually kidnapped and murdered by her husband and her mother. Now, the narrative is driven forward by this love affair. It's what makes people want to read it. It's a very cinematic story. But actually, the novel just uses the relationship as a vehicle for Petry to force a confrontation between a number of opposing elements within the narrative. Yes, most obviously between black and white, but even more important, between different classes of people. It offers a critique of racism, but also a stinging critique of class, especially a critique of the market-driven society on the press, on the police, and most importantly, on an individual's conception of themselves. The Narrows is an eloquent statement of both her anti-racist and her anti-capitalist politics. Furthermore, the interracial relationship, which is at the novel's center, is an exploration of only one form of taboo sexuality. The Narrows also presents us with other considerations of sexuality. There is an openly gay character in the novel, a kind of explicitly homosexual relationship. There are also women who are openly sexual here, both black women and white women. She explores a kind of multidimensional sense of sexuality. And I think that there are all these elements that lands the book on the list of banned books. Yes, this also was a time of banned books. So it landed on the list of banned books for the National Association for Decent Literature, which was called the NODL. And in 1956, the American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement on censorship activity by private organizations and the National Organization for Decent Literature. And it noted that the NDOL was the most prominent, influential, and successful of a number of organizations engaged in censorship activity. And Petry was one of 160 prominent writers who signed the statement against book banning and censorship at the time. So all of this is the context in which her novel came out, but I think it's also the context in which she retreated. It's a context in which she, kind of didn't want to be publicly known for anything other than her writing. So it's nurtured, that sort of privacy, I think, is nurtured by her own sensibilities. She refused to reveal her personal life to reporters and to scholars as alike, believing that if she had to choose, she would choose to be known as a writer and not as a celebrity, and she felt that these concepts were fundamentally incompatible to her. She described the hoopla that surrounded the publication of The Street as turning her into public property. And that phrase pops up again and again and again in her private writings. So as late as 1996, a half century after the first novel appeared, she told a writer, and this quotation I think is so meaningful, she told an interviewer, and I quote, "Continuous public exposure, though it may make you a personality, can diminish you as a person. To be a willing accomplice to the invasion of your own privacy puts a low price on its worth. The creative processes are or should be essentially secret, and although naked flesh is now an open commodity, the naked spirit should have sanctuary." This is a quotation that I return to again and again, and it seems so foreign in our day and time when there is just the desire to be celebrity, especially with social media, where everyone seeks the limelight. And yet I cannot help to think that there is wisdom in it if in fact it might be one of the reasons that we know so little of her and requires her to be discovered again and again. But I think that Petry's writing is as much a source of this kind of wisdom as it is for its beauty, which is why I'm so grateful that we have it in this volume. And for this reason, I return to her again and again and again. And if you haven't read her, I invite you to do so as well. Thank you.